Hello, Lobbert here. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. As always, there's a link in the description to skip the player and commander introductions. Going first is Ryan, also known as Papa Pauper of the Common Connoisseurs, a YouTube channel and Discord community dedicated to competitive Pauper Commander. Their Discord is actually where I look for players when I don't have enough for my competitive streams, and I'm excited to announce that they've taken me on as a partner. I look forward to working with them more in the future, and in light of that, I've asked Ryan for some additional color commentary on this video.
Hello and welcome, connoisseurs of fine common cardboard. My name is Papa Pauper, and today in this video I'm offering commentary on the game from my perspective. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Going second is Mizu-san. Going third is me, your host, Lobbert. And going fourth is Wales. Ryan is playing Thrull Parasite, a 1/1 Thrull for a single black with Extort, and an activated ability with the cost of tap and pay 2 life to remove a counter from target non-land permanent. Mizu-san is playing Bastion Protector, a 3/3 human soldier for 2 and a white, with commander creatures you control get +2/+2 and have indestructible. Lobbert is playing Thraben Watcher, a 2/2 angel for 2 white with flying, vigilance, and other non-token creatures you control get +1/+1 and have vigilance. And Wales is playing Crypt Rats, a 1/1 rat for 2 and a black with an ability with the cost of X that says, Crypt Rats deals X damage to each creature and each player. Spend only black mana on X, and the list that Wales is on is actually Ryan's.
In this match we have 2 control and 2 aggro decks. Entering the game, my primary concern was commander damage, which ignores the life gain that Rats and Parasite both generate. For this reason, I knew that the Black Edict effects from both myself and Wales would play an important role in surviving against Bastion Protector, while Rats would likely sweep up the large and wide board from Thraben Watcher. Looking towards the late game, should I survive the initial aggression from Bastion Protector and Thraben Watcher, I presumed that the game would probably devolve into a battle over the initiative and the Monarch between Wales and I.
Wales takes a mulligan to 6, and the other players keep their opening 7. Now let's get started. Ryan draws for turn, plays a swamp, and his commander, Thrull Parasite. He passes. Mizu-san draws, plays Remote Farm as his land, and passes. Lobbert draws a card, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, and passes. Wales draws, plays a swamp, and passes. Ryan draws a card, plays a swamp, and Flywheel Racer. He then attacks Lobbert for 1 with Thrull Parasite, and passes. Mizu-san draws for turn, plays a Plains, and his commander, Bastion Protector. Mizu-san passes. Lobbert draws, plays a Snow-Covered Plains and Skycrier. He passes. Wales draws a card, plays a swamp, and passes. Ryan draws, plays a swamp, and uses Thrull Parasite to crew Flywheel Racer. He then attacks Wales with Flywheel Racer. Wales takes 3 damage. After combat, Ryan plays Fleshbag Marauder and pays for Thrull Parasite's Extort ability, so each of his opponents lose 1 life and he gains 3 life.
Though Mass Edicts have become increasingly inconsistent in the meta, I kept my hand on the relative strength of Fleshbag Marauder in this particular matchup, hoping that it would buy me significant time against Bastion Protector.
Ryan passes. Mizu-san draws a card and removes the last counter on his remote farm, so it's sacrificed, and he plays Mindstone. He passes. Lobbert draws for turn, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, and Great Sword of Tyr. Lobbert passes. Wales draws, plays a swamp, and passes. Ryan draws a card, uses Thrull Parasite to crew Flywheel Racer, and attacks Lobbert, who takes 3 damage. After combat, Ryan plays Guardian Idol and then Knight's Whisper. He pays for Thrull Parasite's Extort ability, so he gains 3 life and then loses 2 off of Knight's Whisper and draws 2 cards. He passes. Mizu-san draws, plays Spare Supplies to draw a card, and a Plains. Mizu-san passes. Lobbert draws a card, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, and passes. Wales draws for turn, plays a Swamp, and his commander, Crypt Rats. He passes. Ryan draws, uses Thrull Parasite to crew Flywheel Racer, pays 2 to turn Guardian Idol into a creature, and goes to combat. He attacks Mizu-san with Guardian Idol and Wales with Flywheel Racer, so Mizu-san takes 2 damage and Wales takes 3. After combat, Ryan plays Mindstone and pays for Thrull Parasite's Extort ability. He then plays the Dross Pits as his land and passes. In his end step, Lobbert targets Flywheel Racer with Expel to exile it. Mizu-san draws a card, sacrifices Spare Supplies to draw another card, and plays a Plains. Mizu-san passes. Lobbert draws, plays Forge of Heroes as his land, and his commander, Thraben Watcher. Uses Forge of Heroes to put a counter on Thraben Watcher, and passes. Wales draws a card, plays a swamp, and passes. Ryan draws for turn, attacks Wales for 1 with Thrull Parasite, and plays Bojuka Bog, which exiles Lobbert's graveyard. He passes. Mizu-san draws, plays Bone Splitter, and Great Sword of Tyr. He passes. In his end step, Ryan plays Doomblade on Thraben Watcher and pays for Thrull Parasite's Extort ability, so Thraben Watcher is destroyed.
With Bastion Protector significantly delayed and no other good targets for Doomblade, I decided to remove Thraben Watcher before protection was available to buy myself additional time and continue to slow down the sources of aggression.
Lobbert draws a card, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, and Sky Scanner, so he draws a card. He then equips Great Sword of Tyr to it and passes. Wales draws, plays a Swamp, and passes. In his end step, Ryan sacrifices Mind Stone to draw a card. Ryan then draws for turn, pays 2 life to cycle Street Wraith, plays Felwar Stone, and pays for the Extort. He then plays a Swamp and passes. Mizu-san draws for turn and plays Standard Bearer. Wales responds by targeting Crypt Rats with Cruel Feeding to give it +1/+0 and lifelink this turn. The Standard Bearer resolves, and Mizu-san passes. In his end step, Wales activates Crypt Rats for 5. Mizu-san targets Standard Bearer with Shelter to give it protection from black and draw a card. Ryan then plays Deadly Dispute, sacrificing Thrull Parasite, and pays for Extort, so he makes a treasure token and draws 2 cards. The Crypt Rat's damage resolves, so Sky Scanner and Crypt Rats die. Wales' opponents each take 5, and Wales gains 25 life. Wales allows Crypt Rats to stay in the graveyard. Lobbert draws for turn, and plays Heliod's Pilgrim, which puts Benevolent Blessing into his hand. He then equips Great Sword of Tyr to Heliod's Pilgrim, and passes. Wales draws a card, and plays Liliana's Spectre, so Ryan discards Final Flourish, Mizu-san discards Lapse of Certainty, and Lobbert discards Ramosian Rally. Next, Wales plays Abyssal Gatekeeper, and passes. Ryan draws, and pays 3 for his commander, Thrull Parasite. He filters a mana through Study Hall to scry 1 card to the top, and 1 to the bottom. He then plays Basilica Screecher, and pays for Extort. Ryan passes.
Despite the Crypt Rats very obviously placed in the yard and the Abyssal Gatekeeper in play, I decided to extend into the board with my Basilica Screecher, knowing that doing so would double my clock against Mizu-san and Lobbert, who are still my primary concern in the game.
Mizu-san draws a card and plays the Fair Basilica as his land. He then equips Standard Bearer with Bone Splitter and Great Sword of Tyr and attacks Ryan. Great Sword of Tyr triggers, so he taps Basilica Screecher and Standard Bearer gets a +1/+1 counter. Ryan takes 4 and Mizu-san passes. In his end step, Lobbert targets Standard Bearer with Cut Short to destroy it. Mizu-san responds by flashing in Triclopian Sight enchanting Standard Bearer, which gives it +1/+1, Vigilance, and most importantly untaps it, which makes it an illegal target for Cut Short. Lobbert draws for turn and pays for his commander, Thraben Watcher. He then attacks Wales with Heliod's Pilgrim. Great Sword of Tyr triggers, which taps Abyssal Gatekeeper. Wales takes 3 damage and Lobbert passes. Wales draws and passes. In his end step, Ryan sacrifices the Dross Pits to draw a card. Ryan draws for turn and goes to combat. He attacks Mizu-san with Basilica Screecher for 1 damage. After combat, he plays Slum Reaper, paying to extort twice. Ryan sacrifices Slum Reaper, Mizu-san sacrifices Standard Bearer, Lobbert sacrifices Heliod's Pilgrim, and Wales sacrifices Liliana's Spectre. Ryan passes.
While this edict may initially look rather strange as the creatures in play were not premium, I had Blood Fountain in hand and knew that keeping Mizu's Bastion Protector board clear kept it vulnerable to Abyssal Gatekeeper, which Wales wisely kept in play.
Mizu-san draws and passes. Lobbert draws a card and plays a Snow-Covered Plains and equips Great Sword of Tyr to Thraben Watcher. He then attacks Ryan with Thraben Watcher. Great Sword of Tyr triggers, so Lobbert taps Thrull Parasite and puts a counter on Thraben Watcher. Ryan takes 3 damage. After combat, Lobbert plays Rock's Veteran and passes. In his end step, Wales plays Omen of the Dead, which returns Crypt Rats to Wales' hand. Wales draws for turn and plays his commander, Crypt Rats, from his hand. He passes. Ryan draws and plays Blood Fountain, which creates a blood token. He then attacks Wales with Thrull Parasite and Basilica Screecher, so Wales takes 2 damage. Ryan passes. Mizu-san draws a card and plays Goliath Paladin, which gives him the initiative, so he puts a Plains into his hand, which he plays, and follows up with Fairy Guide Mother. He passes. Lobbert draws and goes to combat. He attacks Mizu-san with Thraben Watcher and Ryan with Rock's Veteran. Great Sword of Tyr taps Fairy Guide Mother and puts a +1/+1 counter on Thraben Watcher. Rock's Veteran's Battlecry triggers, so Mizu-san takes 5 damage and Ryan takes 3. Lobbert takes the initiative, so he puts a Snow-Covered Plains into his hand, which he plays after combat, and passes. In his end step, Wales sacrifices Omen of the Dead to scry 2. In response, Ryan targets Basilica Screecher with Blessing of Leeches and pays to extort twice. Moment of the Dead's ability resolves, the whale scries both cards to the top. Wheels draws for turn and targets Crypt Rats with Alchemist's Gift to give it +1/+1 and lifelink or death touch this turn. In response, Ryan targets Crypt Rats with Anoint with Affliction to exile it. Wheels responds by targeting it with Moment of Defiance and give Crypt Rats +2/+1 and lifelink this turn. Moment of Defiance resolves, and then Wheels activates Crypt Rats for 2. Lobbert responds by targeting Basilicus Creature with Crypt Swap to exile it and give Ryan a 1/1 Shapeshifter token. Crypt Rat's ability resolves, so each of Whale's opponents take 2 damage, Whale's Crypt Rats and Abyssal Gatekeeper die, Ryan's Thrull Parasite and Shapeshifter token die, Mizu-san's Fairy Guide Mother dies, and Whales gains 22 life. Wheels allows Crypt Rats to stay in the graveyard, and Abyssal Gatekeeper triggers, so Mizu-san sacrifices Goliath Paladin, and Lobbert sacrifices Rocks Veteran. Wheels then plays Mortuary Mire as his land, which puts Crypt Rats back on top of his deck. He passes. Ryan draws for turn, and plays Chain Devil. Lobbert responds by targeting Thraben Watcher with Otherworldly Journey to exile it until the beginning of the next end step. Chain Devil resolves, so it's sacrificed to its own ability. Ryan then activates Guardian Idol to make it a creature and attack Lobbert, who takes 2 damage, so Ryan takes the initiative, which puts a swamp into his hand.
This sequence here demonstrates the importance of rocks that become creatures, which are basically the man lands of Pauper Commander. With the board clear and the Monarch of the Initiative in play, these rocks such as Fountain of Ichor, Guardian Idol, and Flywheel Racer turned creatures can secure significant uncontested value after board wipes.
Ryan plays the swamp and passes, so Thraben Watchers return to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter off of Otherworldly Journey. Mizu-san draws, plays Basilisk Gate as his land, and Custody Squire. Mizu-san votes for Goliath Paladin, and the rest of the players vote for Fairy Guide Mother, so Fairy Guide Mother is returned to Mizu-san's hand. Mizu-san passes. Lobbert draws a card and goes to combat. He attacks Ryan with Thraben Watcher, so it gets a +1/+1 counter off of Greatsword of Tyr. Ryan takes 4 damage, so Lobbert takes the initiative, which puts 2 more +1/+1 counters on Thraben Watcher. He passes. Wales draws and plays his Commander Crypt Rats from his hand. He then plays an Executioner's Capsule and passes. In his end step, Ryan sacrifices Blood Fountain to return Street Wraith and Fleshbag Marauder to his hand. Ryan draws for turn and plays his own Crypt Rats, which he activates for 6. Lobbert responds with Safe Passage to prevent the damage to his life total and creature. Wales responds by targeting his own Crypt Rats with Return to Action.
This was an incredibly complicated and scary sequence of events. My goal was to kill Mizu and Lobbert and the Crypt Rats while gaining the initiative when Lobbert died, giving me an excellent position for the 1v1 I was trying to orchestrate with Wales. There are 2 scenarios where I would have been punished for the way I played here, and I managed to avoid both of them, by luck alone. Had Lobbert not cast Safe Passage and died to the Crypt Rats, Wales would have resolved Return to Action, which would have left him a creature in play to attack me, gaining the initiative and holding it for the rest of the game with his Crypt Rats. Had Lobbert resolved the Safe Passage and Wales not cast the Return to Action, this would have left me the prime target for Lobbert with his attacking Thraben Watcher, likely leaving me dead on board.
The Crypt Rat's ability damage resolves, so both Crypt Rats die, and each player takes 6 damage except Lobbert, which eliminates Mizu-san. Return to Action triggers and returns Crypt Rats to the battlefield tapped. Ryan passes. In his end step, Lobbert plays the Banishing Coil's half of Guardian Naga to exile Executioner's Capsule. Lobbert untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity, choosing to trap Wales for 5 damage and then draws for turn. He goes to combat and attacks Wales with Thraben Watcher, which gets a counter off of Greatsword of Tyr. Wales takes 7 damage. After combat, Lobbert plays Blessed Hippogriff and passes. Wales draws a card and plays Grasp of Darkness on Blessed Hippogriff. Lobbert responds by targeting Blessed Hippogriff with Benevolent Blessing to give it protection from black. Wales then plays Opal Palace as his land and passes. Ryan draws for turn and pays 5 for Thrull Parasite and filters a mana through Study Hall to scry 1 card to the top and 2 to the bottom. He passes. Lobbert untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity, choosing to draw a card. He then draws for turn, plays Obsidian Acolyte, and goes to combat. He attacks Wales with Thraben Watcher and Ryan with Blessed Hippogriff. Thraben Watcher gets a counter off of Greatsword of Tyr, which also taps Wales' Crypt Rats. Wales takes 8 damage, which brings him to 15 commander damage, and Ryan takes 3 damage. Lobbert passes. In his end step, Wales activates Crypt Rats for 5, which kills Crypt Rats and Thrull Parasite and deals 5 damage to each player. Wales finally allows Crypt Rats to return to the command zone. Whales draws for turn and pays 5 mana for Crypt Rats and filters a mana through Opal Palace, so Crypt Rats enters with 2+1/+1 counters. Whales then activates Crypt Rats for 1 to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. Lobbert is eliminated, so Whales takes the initiative, which puts a swamp into his hand. Whales plays the swamp and passes. Ryan draws, plays a swamp, and Fleshbag Marauder. Whales responds by sacrificing Crypt Rats to play Reckoner's Bargain to gain 3 life and draw 2 cards. Fleshbag Marauder's ability resolves, so Ryan sacrifices Fleshbag Marauder. Ryan then plays Street Wraith and activates Guardian Idol to make it a 2/2 creature, which he uses to attack Whales, who takes 2 damage, so Ryan takes the initiative and puts 2+1/+1 counters on Street Wraith and passes.
The gaining of the Monarch of the Initiative on an empty board is an important turning point in any matchup, signaling that one player is likely to gain control of that resource for an extended period of time. I knew that at this moment forward, control of the initiative was going to be the single most important determining factor as to whether I won or lost. I also knew that if I allowed Whales to gain control of the initiative, that he would likely never give it up, since his commander Crypt Rats would allow him to repeatedly kill my creatures as I attempted to retake the emblem.
Whales draws for turn and plays Debt to the Kami on Ryan, so he exiles Street Wraith. He then plays Audacious Thief and passes. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity, which deals 5 damage to Whales. Ryan then draws, plays Takacia's Digsite as his land, and passes. Whales draws a card and attacks Ryan with Audacious Thief, which triggers, so Whales loses 1 life and draws a card. Ryan activates Guardian Idol to make it a 2/2 and blocks with it. Whales targets Audacious Thief with Unexpected Fangs and put a +1/+1 and lifelink counter on it. Guardian Idol dies, and Whales gains 3 off of lifelink. Whales passes. In his end step, Ryan activates Takacia's Digsite to surveil 1. He leaves the card on top. Ryan then sacrifices his blood token, discarding Executioner's Capsule to draw a card. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity, which draws him a card. He then draws for turn, plays a swamp, and Thorn of the Black Rose, which gives him the Monarch. He then passes and triggers the Monarch. Whales responds by playing Go for the Throat on Thorn of the Black Rose to destroy it. Ryan then activates Takacia's Digsite to surveil a card to the top. The Monarch trigger then resolves, so Ryan draws a card. Whales draws for turn and attacks Ryan with Audacious Thief, which triggers, so Whales loses 1 life and draws a card. Ryan then plays Darkness to prevent combat damage this turn. After combat, Whales plays a swamp, Nihil Spellbomb, and pays 7 for his commander, Crypt Rats. He filtered a mana through Opal Palace, so it enters with 3+1/+1 counters. Whales passes. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity. He hits the Throne of the Dead 3, so he reveals the top 10 cards of his deck. Among them, he only finds Gloomfang Mauler, which he puts into play with 3+1/+1 counters and hexproof until his next turn. Gloomfang Mauler's ability triggers, which puts an additional 2+1/+1 counters on it. Ryan then draws for turn and targets Crypt Rats with a Victim of Night to destroy it. Whales responds by sacrificing Crypt Rats to Deadly Dispute to draw 2 cards and make a treasure. Next, Ryan plays Twisted Abomination and passes. The Monarch triggers, so Ryan draws. Whales draws for turn and targets himself with Sign in Blood to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Whales then attacks Ryan with Audacious Thief, which triggers, so Whales draws a card and loses 1 life. Ryan blocks with Twisted Abomination and regenerates it. Whales responds by sacrificing Audacious Thief to Altar's Reap to draw 2 cards. After combat, he plays a swamp and Slum Reaper. Its ability resolves, so Whales sacrifices it, and Ryan sacrifices Twisted Abomination. Next, Whales targets the Slum Reaper with Crawl from the Cellar to return it to his hand, which he then replays, so Whales sacrifices it, and Ryan sacrifices Gloomfang Mauler. Finally, Whales sacrifices Nihil Spellbomb to exile Ryan's graveyard, and passes. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he restarts the Undercity, which puts a swamp into his hand. He then surveils 1 with Takacia's Digsite, keeping the card on top, and then draws for turn. He plays a swamp and Staunch Throne Guard, but he's already the Monarch. He passes and draws off the Monarch. Whales draws and plays a swamp. He pays 9 for Crypt Rats and filters a mana through Opal Palace, so it enters with 4+1/+1 counters. Whales passes. In his end step, Ryan plays Succumb to Temptation to draw 2 cards. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity, choosing to put 2+1/+1 counters on Staunch Throne Guard, draws for turn, and plays Quicksand as his land. He then cycles Polluted Mire, plays Troll of Khazad-dûm, and passes, drawing off of the Monarch.
In this moment, you might be wondering why I extended into the Crypt Rats on board, knowing that my opponent had sufficient mana to kill both of my creatures. The reason is that control of the initiative in the Monarch is predicated on having creatures in play to block your opponent's creatures. If I had chosen instead to sandbag the Troll of Khazad-dûm to save it from the sweeper, I would have opened myself up to targeted removal from Wales, potentially killing the Staunch Throne Guard with an empty board and allowing him to attack, gain the initiative in the Monarch, and then control it using Crypt Rats, which would have been a devastating swing and likely would have lost me the game on the spot. By extending into the Crypt Rats with the Troll of Khazad-dûm, I'm playing to my outs, knowing that control of the initiative in the Monarch is the most important feature left in this game.
In his end step, Wales activates Crypt Rats to deal 2 damage to each player. Wales draws for turn, plays a Swamp, and Chain Devil. Ryan responds by playing Blood Pact to draw 2 and lose 2 life. Ryan then targets Chain Devil with Echoing Decay to give it -2/-2 this turn. Wales responds by activating Crypt Rats 5 times for 1 damage each, so each player takes 5 damage. Both of Wales' creatures die, and Ryan's Troll of Khazad-dûm does as well. Wales chooses to leave Crypt Rats in the graveyard. Chain Devil's ability resolves, so Ryan sacrifices Staunch Throne Guard. Wales passes. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity, choosing to deal 5 damage to Wales. Ryan then activates Tikassia's Dig Site to surveil a card to the top. He then draws for turn and plays Witch's Cottage as his land, which moves Troll of Khazad-dûm from his graveyard to the top of his deck. Next, he plays Siphon Mind, so Wales discards Pestilence, and Ryan draws a card. He plays Troll of Khazad-dûm and passes. The Monarch triggers, and Wales responds with Vraska's Fall, so Ryan sacrifices Troll of Khazad-dûm and gets a poison counter. The Monarch resolves, so Ryan draws a card. Wales draws for turn, and flashes back Crawl from the cellar to return Crypt Rats to his hand, which he plays. He filtered a mana through Opal Palace, so it enters with 4+1/+1 counters. He then plays Mind Stone and sacrifices it to draw a card. Next, he plays a Swamp and passes. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity, which draws him a card. He draws for turn and plays a Swamp. He then targets Crypt Rats with Go for the Throat to destroy it. Next, he pays 9 for Thrull Parasite and filters a mana through Study Hall, so he scries 2 cards to the top and 2 cards to the bottom. He then plays Springleaf Drum and pays for Extort. Finally, he plays Infernal Idol and passes, drawing off of the Monarch. Wales draws a card and pays 11 for Crypt Rats. He filtered a mana through Opal Palace, so it enters with 5+1/+1 counters. Wales then targets Crypt Rats with Rush of Vitality to give it +1/+0, lifelink, and indestructible this turn. He then activates Crypt Rats so Thrull Parasite dies, Ryan takes 1 damage, and Wales gains 3 life. Wales passes. Ryan untaps with the initiative, so he progresses through the Undercity. He hits the Throne of the Dead 3, so he reveals the top 10 cards of his deck. Among them, he finds Vicious Battle Rager, Syndicate Enforcer, Underdark Explorer, and Cemetery Gate. He chooses to put Vicious Battle Rager into play with 3+1/+1 counters and hexproof until his next turn. Vicious Battle Rager makes him restart the Undercity, so he puts a Swamp into his hand. He then activates Tikassia's Dig Site to surveil 1, choosing to keep the card on top. He then plays Opal Palace as his land and pays 11 for Thrull Parasite. He filtered a mana through Opal Palace, so it enters with 5+1/+1 counters. He passes, draws off of the Monarch, and targets Crypt Rats with Defile to give it -12/-12. Wales allows Crypt Rats to go to the graveyard, stating that his only out is a reanimation spell to wipe the board and maybe force a tie. Wales draws for turn, shows a Rend Flesh, and concedes. Congratulations on your victory, Ryan. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Check the playlists on this channel for more videos like this. Patreon shoutout to Achu, I've Cryptid, and Bill, Too Much Do. Thank you.